Greetings, students. Welcome to a little bit more information about Module 2, the profession of counseling. When I made the other video very quickly, after I looked at it, I realized there's just not enough in there about what you're studying and about what I want you to get out of this. And, this goes for the whole course. I really want you to leave here at the end of the semester with a really good understanding of what counseling is and a pretty good knowledge of several different theories. So what we're studying in the first content module here, which is Module 2, is sort of the basis, the very important part about the profession of counseling itself. I became a counselor very late in my career after some work in corporate America when I felt like in addition to managing sales organizations, I was also doing a lot of counseling anyway. So I had a tragic event occur in my life, and after that I decided it was time for me to really do what was in my heart. And that's when I decided to go back to school and get a master's degree here at East Tennessee State and become a counselor. And I love it. And I hope you can see the love of it for yourself if it is a fit for you. And that's one of the things that you should be able to decide throughout this course. So I, again, look forward to having you all participate and learn together, and I'm really excited to have you in the class. Before we talk about Module 2, there's a couple of things I want to include. There is an assessment at the end of Module 2. The way I have the assessment set up in D2L is that you must take it either one of 2 days. And so I need to know right up front if one of these 2 days is not a time when you can actually sit down at some point in that 48-hour period and take a 17-question quiz, which should only take you 5 minutes to complete. I mean, it's very, very simple. True, false, a couple of multiple choice, maybe a couple of matching. I have the time limit set on the assessment for about 12 minutes, I think. Should take you only 5. But the 2 days of access will be Thursday and Friday, February 7th and 8th. If any of you cannot, in that 48-hour period, find 10 minutes to go to D2L and take that assessment, I need you to contact me on email and let me know about that. So that's number one in this video if you're taking any kind of notes whatsoever. Secondly, it's a good idea for you to have the D2L content section open as we go through this video. And I will make this video, I promise you, much briefer than the first one. I don't want you to have to sit through 45 minutes of video. And as I suggested to you, it's good if you see one that long to break it up in segments of 15 minutes or something like that. Come back to it when you're fresh. So I assume by now you are completely familiar with Module 1, and that is all the administrative documents, the course syllabus, the schedules, and that if you have had any questions about those, that hopefully by now you have gone to the open forum and asked those questions so that all the class can see. So with no further delay, let's get into Module 2. In the earlier video, I covered the objectives from the syllabus, but I feel that it would be a good idea to just go through those again. So let's look at the objectives. You see on your screen here, the third objective in the syllabus. We're exploring the profession of counseling. Accepting ways to reach people with diversity in many ways. And the next objective, to examine the profession of counseling, codes of ethics, and other codes other than ACA, which we're going to just focus on ACA and National Association of Social Workers, and the American School Counselors Association, which is included in your D2L content. Students will gain an understanding of ethical principles such as confidentiality, which you have a separate Word document on in D2L that you really should know and study. Informed consent. NUCRUG in your course reserve covers informed consent. Duty to warn, having to do with an exception to confidentiality. Protect privileged communication, and some boundary issues and dual and multiple relationships. And there we go with the multicultural values, which is so important as we examine the profession of counseling. As you know already, you have course reserves for this course, and it is really important that you access those in that time frame that's given between January 24th and February the 2nd. Now, it doesn't mean that you can only access it just for that period of time and all of a sudden it's gone, because you can save it on your own device as an electronic document. So save those course reserves. It is the first and third chapters of NUCRUG's book, and it is the Appendix A of that book, same book, and also information from a book written by Ivy and Ivy. And then, of course, there's our D2L content. We have, if you'll look at your D2L screen, directions for study are there, and that includes the discussion items. We talked a lot about how to do discussion items in the first video. There's some links there to help you with your self-analysis paper. One thing you're going to have to do is take the Myers-Briggs assessment online in order to complete that paper. So there's directions there about that and a link to get to it. The rubric for that paper is also in D2L for you. Remember, it is due on the 9th of February. And then there are PowerPoint presentations in D2L. The worldview, I would definitely look at that PowerPoint before you write your paper. Cultural bias in psychology, and then something about assessments. And while I won't spend a lot of time in the video about assessments, there is some information in that PowerPoint on assessments about different assessments being used by different counselors, and you should know those for our end of module quiz. And of course there's the mental status exam, which is also on the quiz, I believe. And then we have codes of ethics that are listed there in your D2L content. And the document on confidentiality and the licensing information for the state of Tennessee. So let's go forward and talk about the profession of counseling. The American Counseling Association gives this definition of counseling that I will ask you to look at on the screen. It's a professional relationship that empowers diverse individuals. There you have the multicultural piece. Families and groups to accomplish mental health, wellness, education, and career goals. A long thought-out process to come up with this definition by the American Counseling Association. And to go into the history, just a tad on the history of counseling, it really didn't come about until the late 1800s when the first psychodynamic theories came about. Freud and the folks that we'll get into in Module 3 when we study psychodynamic theories. But it was really then that counseling began in the like 1950s, and because of B.F. Skinner's work in behaviorism. So behaviorism was really the first approach to counseling, behavioral rules, scientifically approached rules. Then we moved a little bit back into psychodynamic theories. We moved from that to humanistic theories, which are existential, Gestalt, and Carl Rogers' person-centered theories. Now, you don't have to remember all this. I'm just giving you a little outline of where we've been, just in a brief capsule here. And then the fourth force of counseling is multiculturalism, and it was brought about by more of the postmodern theories, where we began to understand that we are who we are because of how we've grown up and the culture that we live in and the rules of our society. So those are the four forces of counseling, with multiculturalism being the most current one. So from that definition, Newkrug then goes into a complete exploration of the counseling profession. He talks about different professionals. He talks about organizations that certify and license, and by the way, certification is not the same as licensure. He goes through some professional groups like ACA, NASW, and LMFT, the American AM LMFT, the American Marriage and Family Theories group. And he also talks about different types of therapists. So I think it's really good information for you to know, because if you are exploring this and taking this course thinking about ultimately being a counselor, it is really good for you to know about your fit into the right type of counselor. So I think Newkrug does a real good exploration of the different types, and I think you really need to think about your fit among the ones discussed. The effective helper, are you cut out for it? Newkrug uses something about an it factor that we'll discuss in a few minutes, but at one point, there was some research on whether or not counseling was effective at all. And the research that was done a long, long time ago said, people can change whether they go to counseling or not, which is sometimes true. But what makes counseling really effective is written here on this screen. The client's got to be ready to change. Counselor is not going to do something by herself or himself. And the client must have the psychological resources, in other words, the agency to make changes. The social supports need to be there, and evidence-based factors need to be used. Evidence-based techniques and theories, which we will study only evidence-based theories in this course. Then I have an asterisk there beside counselors' ability to develop a strong working alliance, because the advent of Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy brought us to the understanding that empathetic listening and acceptance of the client and the counselors being genuine with the client was possibly the most important part of building that strong alliance. So here you see in this screen some common factors of successful counselors. Now, Newkrug listed these, but he borrowed them totally, except for the last three, he borrowed them totally from Carl Rogers. I would want you to spend a lot of time in Newkrug reading about these individual ones and understand this, because this is, in fact, a listing of the common elements of success in counseling. And I would add, embracing a wellness perspective simply means not simply pathologizing somebody. And we do that in our own society now. People think they know what bipolar means, and the bipolar diagnosis has been thrown around so often and given as a diagnosis so often that sometimes it's overdiagnosed, I think. So a successful counselor will come to the session embracing a wellness frame of mind rather than a pathology frame of mind, and looking for the pathology. Although to get insurance payment you must put a label on it. So there's part of the dichotomy, the rub, if you will, in our current system of payment and what really is successful in counseling. So it can be a shame. All right. So you see that those first six, at least, or the first grouping of that is taken from Carl Rogers, the person-centered theorist. Newkrug talks about an it factor. And, you might want to actually figure out what your it factor is. Newkrug talks about that in that chapter, but it is the unique personality characteristics that allow you to build a bond with others. And most of us know what those things are about ourselves. And I would want you to include that in the self-analysis paper as well, although it's not specifically written in the rubric. We go to Rogers' definition of empathy now. And the very first discussion item that you have in your directions for study has to do with the first post I want you to make, and that is whether or not you have had a personal experience, and hopefully you have, of listening or being listened to empathetically. So before you do your discussion post, you want to look at this that's in Newkrug's book and understand what empathetic listening actually is. It is the ability to accurately sense the feelings and personal meanings of someone else. You're sensing what they're feeling as they're talking with you. Then you can communicate that back. You can replay or say back, what I hear you saying is that you're feeling really, really sad about your sister's death. That's an example. And that as a therapist, I so deeply understand and sense this feeling in the client that I can even go a level lower and understand what's behind, what's below that feeling of grief or that feeling of depression, the feeling of sadness, or the feeling of joy with a client. I mean, we are sometimes talking about wellness as well. So before you go do your discussion post, I want you to think hard about, have you ever had this experience of either being listened to or listening to someone empathetically? If you haven't had the experience, I would ask you to do so and then write about the experience in your first discussion post. The words unconditional positive regard are, every time you hear that word, you're going to think of Carl Rogers, and we will cover more about Carl Rogers when we get to the humanistic module, which is, I think, module 4. So, but you'll remember it from here. I would say unconditional positive regard for the client. That's Carl Rogers and his person-centered theory. You should actually assess yourself in those areas that Newkrug relays from Rogers. And also in that course reserve on page 21, there's a wellness inventory, which I think would be really fun for you to take in learning about yourself. Let's move on to ethics. We wonder sometimes, well, why do we have to have all these codes of ethics, and why is it so important? Well, it is important because the client, it's important that we do no harm. I mean, and that is the number one factor, I think, in ethics and counseling is do no harm. So if you have an ethical decision to make, that's the first question to ask. Is there going to be harm done here? There is a case about a 17-year-old student that Newkrug has there, and it'd be interesting to understand what you think your obligations are in that case. There's a thing on a bit on page 68 about ethically correct behavior. Some information there about dual relationships, and I would ask you to look at, take one of the codes of ethics. You don't have to look at all of them, but take one of the codes of ethics that speaks to you most and look at what it says about confidentiality, about multiple relationships, about all the things that were mentioned in that objective in the syllabus, because that's where we're going with it. So let's talk about confidentiality just a moment. This is a document that is in your D2L content section, but it's also a document that I use in my personal counseling. I give this to the client, and this is the statement on confidentiality that I want my clients to understand. Your confidentiality is protected by law and professional ethical standards. I can only release information to others with your written permission, with the exceptions. So although confidentiality is the hallmark of counseling, there are exceptions to it, and here are the written exceptions to protection of confidentiality. If there is harm to be done to a child or elderly person or a person with a disability, I'm required by law, not just the Code of Ethics, but by law, to file a report with the appropriate state agency. And if I believe that you are going to give bodily harm to someone else, I'm required to take protective actions, which may be including the notification to the potential victim, notifying the police, or seeking appropriate hospitalization. Now, serious bodily harm is the key phrase there. If someone comes to you and says, I'm thinking about cheating on my partner, although that is emotional harm, that's not serious bodily harm, and you wouldn't be required to report that to the partner. So the harm also includes self-harm. If I believe that a client is about to take her or his life, I'm required to take steps to prevent this, which may include seeking hospitalization for the client, contacting family members, and should any of these situations arise, you want to discuss this with the client prior to taking any of these actions. And let the client know and be fully on the table about what your obligations are and your responsibilities are. So I'd ask you to look at that Word document on confidentiality, very, very important part of counseling. So let's go back to New Krug's work. We're about to finish up here. New Krug gives you some problem-solving models. I think these are really good to take in your own experience and also use them step by step, especially Corey's more pragmatic model. Take them step by step and use them in your own personal issues. It's really good. And there's another model there. In fact, on page 76, there's a table of the summary of decision-making models. It'll be good for you to take that and apply it back to the client case listed on page 75. This takes us to that fourth force in multicultural competencies, the multiculturalism as the fourth force. These are the three main items in being a multiculturally competent counselor. You got to be aware of your own values and biases, aware of your client's worldview, which is the psychological orientation that we have in life, and have the ability to also use appropriate intervention strategies. Some intervention strategies or techniques that we'll learn as we study the theories would not work with non-dominant cultures. And the important thing is that we honor the multicultural aspect of our client's worldview and life. So those three items look at figure 31, page 89, and also look at Appendix A in your course reserve about this. Now, finally, the other items for study in Module 2 have to do with the Ivy course reserve. And I want you to take that painting that is in Ivy and spend a little time with it and grasp a deeper meaning of it. I mean, all those people on the stairs and the stairs facing different ways and all of those things. I mean, it really says a lot. So spend a little bit of time with that. And also look at the problem presented by the parent of the 8-year-old. And then what Ivy does is give you different theoretical approaches. Now, you don't have to remember all these theoretical approaches. And we're not taking this opportunity to study theory right now. This is about the profession of counseling. But I think it's good that Ivy goes ahead and mentions some of these theories that we will study later and how different the approaches of the theories are. So I would ask you to keep this Ivy course reserved because we'll probably refer back to it as well. But one thing that Ivy mentions that I just want to read here to you is each theory tells a different story. And at times, one theoretical approach may be more helpful than the other. So that's that culturally appropriate intervention strategy that was mentioned just a little bit earlier. But I think I like this Ivy course reserve because it leads us into a more narrative approach. In other words, we all are a product of our stories. And isn't that true? We really are. And I love the way Ivy approaches this from a counseling standpoint. So the major challenge, as Ivy mentions it, in the book that he has, which we don't have the book, but in this course, it's the same thing, that it's to master several approaches and then develop your own integrated approach. In other words, you're not going to just be a Gestalt therapist. You're not going to be just a postmodern social constructivist feminist therapist. You're going to combine the theories that fit you best, which we have an exercise later in the semester about, and put those together to meet the needs of the client and to do no harm. So that is the coverage of course reserves. I would also ask you to be sure to cover your PowerPoint presentations on cultural bias, the worldview. There is also a PowerPoint on assessments. I'm not going to spend any time on that here in the video. The BDI is the Beck Depression Inventory. It is just one assessment, and there's a review of that assessment. Assessments are very, very important in counseling. It helps the counselor determine hunches, the senses that they have about dealing with the client. So, and especially the mental status exam, use that every day when you write notes, describing the status of the client. So look at the mental status exam. And so I think it's really important. I think I mentioned earlier to you to know the types of assessments matched up to the type of counselor that's going to be on your final assessment. And please let me know. Again, I'll remind you, let me know by email if February the 7th and 8th are not good times during that 48-hour period. Can you sit down at D2L for 10 minutes and take this assessment for Module 1, because that's when it's going to be open. So thank you for listening intently, and the open forum is there for any questions that everybody could benefit from, and I look forward to learning with you. Thanks.